name is Deirdre Mahony. I'm a visual artist. I started out as a painter, but now my practice encompasses everything from plantings, the kind of land art as useful art, through to film, through to installations, making archives, and making paintings and photographs. So it encompasses, I suppose, a very broad spectrum of practice, depending on what medium is appropriate for the subject that I'm dealing with. My concerns are around the future of, I suppose, rural places and the future sustainability of rural places. The term social practice, it's funny, it's one that I don't use very much myself. I like Grant Kester's term, which is dialogical aesthetic, where the aesthetic of the artwork rests in the transformative capacity of the conversation between one person and another. For me, that best describes what it is social practice is. For me, painting wasn't enough when it came to kind of looking at the complexity of our relationship with land and landscape. And my practice gradually shifted from making paintings in the landscape that were also installed in the landscape to making images of kind of land art pieces. I'd made a work called Crossland, which was around the spread of hazel scrub in the Burren and the kind of questions that threw up around sustainability and privileging one kind of a gaze upon landscape over another. And out of that inquiry, I realised that it was necessary to kind of create a space to be present to the different communities that are invested in the land. So from farming communities to blow-ins like myself when I lived in Clare, to the many returned emigrants who came back to Ireland in the 1990s and noughties. So the Crossland project, which was these coppiced X in the hazel scrub, led me to reopen a post office which had been closed for many years, and reopen it as a social space, as a cultural space, as a space in which different communities could bump into one another, could meet one another, and maybe begin to get to know each other. And the reason this was so important for me was because I moved to County Clare, I moved to the Burren in the early 1990s. I had been living in London, I'd had a child, wanted to live back in Ireland, be close to family. I had grown up in Limerick, and the Burren was the place that I'd always visited when I was a child, and I loved it. My move back coincided with a really significant environmental conflict around the construction of an interpretive centre in the Burren. So the conflict lasted for more than 10 years, and it was really divisive. For one section, it offered the hope of your children being able to stay and potentially have employment in the area. For others like me who'd come to the place because of the aesthetic of the landscape, it was a kind of defilement. So you had those two polarities, and mistrust built up. And yet, in parallel, you know, as that time was going by, places like pubs, places like the post offices were being closed. So you were losing the places where you could actually kind of get to know people beyond the position that you imagined they held. That was the primary reason behind reopening the post office, was that it was a place that would allow different people to come together and disagree if they wanted to. But but at least the space would exist. It was a post office that had been, I had used when I moved back to Clare. But it was closed down in 2002. And in 2007, I decided to reopen it. I applied to the Arts Council. I got a project award. I also applied to SuperValue, who also funded it. I knew that I had to engage people. And so I spent 3 months initially clearing, sorting the contents of the post office, which were quite extraordinary, but also laying the groundwork to engage people and thinking about how I might draw people into the space. I then sent out flyers to every house. I used the postal service again, my friendly postman, who delivered the flyers to every single house. So on one side it had a description of what was going to be happening. And on the other side there was a form that said, what do you want to do? So, do you want to form a club? Because that was part of it, was to have it as a space where people could do stuff that they wanted to do. The kind of template was set by the contents of the post office, because when I moved in there after I'd scrubbed about 10 years or 20 years of dirt off the place, there were all the belongings of the postmaster, Mahony, who had lived there, and as I went through these, I was just floored, because he completely upended my expectations of what a man growing up in the west of Ireland who never left the place. He went to Dublin once a year. He went to Ennistimon once a week, and that was it. Yet he lived a life that was totally connected to, intellectual inquiry. He used to order his books from London, from bookshops. He recorded language programmes from the BBC World Service and RTE's language programmes, and he taped them, and I found all these tapes of Mahony's. So I made an installation of some of these belongings, and he had essays and he had all sorts of things. And then when people came into the exhibitions, bit by bit knowledge began to drip out. Like one Dutch woman I know, she said, oh yeah, he used to practice his Dutch on me. And another person came in who was very active in the Mulletmore conflict and would have been very anti it. And she said, oh yeah, he used to give me his shopping list for books in London whenever I was going back to London. So this picture emerged of a man who was totally grounded in place, but completely connected to the wider world. So he was like a cipher for everything the post office was. He kind of morphed into a kind of bridge between the local and the global, It's really, really fascinating. And when I had that first exhibition about Mahony, the capacity of archives and the installation, just these simple belongings of a man who had a passion for gadgets and who loved his radio and had a shortwave radio that used to communicate with all the hippies in North Clare. That became public, and it showed it was a way of describing invisible histories, and that was immediately understood by many of the people who came to participate in activities or who asked to exhibit or to create their own archives for Expo. So the archival process became a way of having those conversations.
Amici, buonasera, and welcome to our 20th lesson. Buonasera, amici, e benvenuti alla nostra 20ª. This
It's actually done with the soot from the fireplace.
Yes, I can see that.
It's very well.
I can see that.
That is the work of art.
It's almost like a ghost or something.
Yeah, you put it through the wall. Yeah, show it.
His spirit.
Oh, I know. You know him at a glance. Yeah.
While these archives were being built up and exhibited, I should say that at the same time the clubs and the groups were running at Expo, and that was working quite well. And they developed a sort of sense of autonomy, different people were running each one. And I also ran a curated programme of exhibitions that reflected some of the themes and the ideas that were going on through the archives and through, I suppose, the other activities at Expo.
We've been having 15, 20 people in here every day in the evenings from 7 till 9, and then more coming in during the day, and people making return visits and coming back in. And there's been a lovely kind of crack going on here actually as well in the evenings, the triggering stories.
In the beginning, I was really concerned about authorship, and I was really concerned to kind of keep my mark on things, and that became less and less important. I gradually realised, which is the kind of essence of collaborative practice, I gradually began to realise that it wasn't necessary for me to have my stamp on the work. The authorship of the archives rests with me along with all the other people that I've worked with. This is a tricky question, and it's hard for artists because it is important that people know what it is you've done. Just in terms of getting support and for future projects and everything else. So I will lay claim to initiating Expo, but everything that's gone on since I've left is nothing to do with me. In a way, it's a source of tremendous happiness to me that Expo continues to run even during lockdown. It's extraordinary, but that's nothing to do with me. And I should talk a little bit about how that came about. For a long time after Expo ceased to be run by me, I think, people regarded me as the de facto person running it, even though I wasn't. Certainly, I would have always been asked if things were happening, what did I think? I kind of became quite used to that. I didn't check in on myself on that, which is something you need to do with this kind of practice. You have to check in with yourself. You have to ask yourself, what am I extracting here? I may not be fully conscious of it, but I need to become aware of the kind of power relations that are going on with any project. If people are always turning to me, what's that saying? About who holds the power, really. And a situation arose where I overstepped a mark at a public meeting. And it was arrogance, it wasn't intended, but it was an arrogant, silly kind of presumption that I made. And I publicly fell from grace. Now, I have to say that was pretty excruciating at the time. It was really hard. But something kind of extraordinary happened as a consequence, because nobody ever asked my opinion again after that. Actually, the real transference took place at that point. And that was really, I think, really important. I wouldn't ever recommend it for the ego, but it was a really important lesson. I think, how could I have avoided that? I could have avoided it had I really reflectively dug into the dynamics of the project and my desire to be perceived as the author. I think had I thought about that in advance of the sort of public fall from grace, I could have saved myself a lot of grief, and probably remained friends with a few people. So that was really hard. And everybody has those points with projects that involve people's subjectivities. The psychodynamics of social practice, call it what you will, dialogical aesthetics, are tricky to negotiate. So it's one of the reasons that I have a recommended text that called If Things Should Quickly Go Pear-Shaped, which will, I hope, be on the website, which I have subsequently found to be a really useful toolkit for helping me to check into those dynamics. One of the things that I would recommend is having these kind of points of reflection in the course of a project, being really transparent with and really in order to be fully transparent, you have to ask yourself first, what am I trying to get out of this? What am I trying to extract? What are my motivations here? And then communicating that, and then asking people what are their expectations. The process provides the opportunity to kind of to literally reflect, to see yourself in a mirror, and to collectively see as a group, if you're working collaboratively or you're working collectively, to see what's been unfolding. Have we fulfilled the expectations that we set out with? Have we listened to and understood one another in our communications? So often, and I hear this a lot from other artists also, we only hear the bits that resonate with our own experiences, and we fail to hear what people, the parts we don't want to hear that people communicate. One of the things I wish I knew when I was starting out with Expo is to trust through the process, not to be so worried and concerned about what others, whether the art world or whatever, the parish council, whatever, what others were thought about the project, but to stay true to the process, to trust the authority of my senses, in a sense, to quote Aquinas, because that kind of fear of external evaluation, of external judgment, all too often gets in the way of seeing the real beauty of what's beginning to unfold. And I think all too often those moments are so fleeting, but they're the ones that are the really important heart of a project. And if you miss them because you're so worried about what the world outside is thinking, then you're really going to be in trouble. I suppose the other thing that I wish I'd known, I really wish I had done this, was the importance of reflective writing as you're going along. because it allows you the opportunity to step back. And, you know, I was, as we are always under pressure. I was teaching full time. I was doing a PhD. I was doing this project. I have a family. I had lots of commitments, but I wish I had taken the time to just step back once a week and write about what was going on. Critical, reflective writing. Because, again, it's a way of taking the temperature of what's actually happening. And I think that's the most important thing to take away.
That's a lovely pot of tea.